Greetings, Ohio Valley. This is Dan Lima with OSU Extension from Belmont County.
And this is Karen Cox from WVU Extension in Ohio County. Thanks for tuning in to Extension Calling, your source for research-based information for the farm, garden, and home. Dan is away on military leave right now, so we're going to bring back some of our previous shows that didn't make it to the podcast. We hope that you enjoy them. As always, we welcome your feedback. If you'd like a written transcript of the show, please email me at Karen, Karen, .cox, COX, at mail, MAIL, .wvu.edu, or call 304-234-3673. Thanks again for listening. COVID-19 vaccines were given to tens of thousands of people in early clinical trials and to hundreds of millions of Americans since. Top health experts agree that COVID-19 vaccines are safe, effective, and trusted. Visit vaccinate.wv.gov or contact your local health department.
So one of the things I really wanted to touch on today, because I hear from a lot of farmers who are trying to get started into the field and or they're no longer able to actively farm. And so we have on those two spectrums. And one of the things that could help bridge that gap between the new farmer who has no land and no equipment and the older farmer who is ready to get out of farming but doesn't want to see their farmland go stale, and maybe their kids aren't interested in coming back to the farm at this time. So one of the things that can be done is a farm lease. Now, most of the leases that we deal with are cash leases. It's I'm going to give you X dollars per acre to farm this land. And a lot of the leases are also verbal agreements like, hey, you seem like a good person. I'm going to go ahead and let you use my land. Just give me so many dollars per acre and so I can cover my taxes on it and we'll be good. However, the problem with those types of leases is A, they're not enforceable. And B, it is really hard for both the landowner and the land renter to know exactly what the other one expects of them. So for instance, if someone is going to use some land to produce some hay, whose responsibility is it to make sure that the pH and nutrient levels stay up? Is it the landowner because the land is staying with that owner? Or is it the person who is harvesting the hay because they want to see that value turned over in their hay production? Those are things that really need to be written out and talked about. And so one of the things I'm going to try to do today is give you some talking points to help you determine whether or not you really do want to lease your land, whether or not you really do want to lease some land, and what are the things that you can do to open the discussion to help make those decisions and have it be very clear up front. It's really rough when someone was working with earlier. They were leasing some plots of land. They had planted lots of produce on them. They were getting ready to harvest, and the person who was leasing them on a verbal agreement decided they wanted to sell the property. And right before harvest, the landowner took the land back and refused to allow the leasee onto the property, and therefore they lost their entire summer's worth of work, as well as the investment they had put into the plots, as well as that year's harvest. And it's really frustrating when things like that happen. And it's not always someone's intent to do that when they get started, but they don't know what's coming up. The future is always uncertain. There may be a hospital visit where you need some fast cash. There are all sorts of things that can come up that could change how you planned to do things. And if you're a leasee, there are steps you can do to protect yourself, even if the land is sold. That way you can at least harvest what you planted that year, or potentially continue to lease the land under the ownership of the new landlord. And so some of those things I'm going to talk about today, but I will go ahead and preface this as very clear statement that I am not a lawyer. This is not legal advice and all that fun stuff. So unfortunately, I have to say that. But, it's important that if you are doing a lease, you may want to consider meeting with an attorney that understands agriculture. So agricultural leases are a little different than just simply leasing a house or even leasing some equipment or a building. Agricultural leases are kind of funny because agriculture itself is kind of funny. It's a different type of management system, and it doesn't always translate directly into your standard leasing agreement. And so if you're going online and you're downloading some basic lease agreements, make sure that all of the questions you want answered are in that lease agreement somewhere. I mean, all lease agreements have the same basic format, but there are some extra things for agriculture that you want to make sure you include. And so we'll start off with the very basics, and there's two main kinds of leases that will cover most farmland leasing arrangements, and that is the cash lease and the crop share lease. So just like they sound, the cash lease is I will give you X number of dollars to lease X number of acres. And that is it. That is a cash lease done. The crop share lease is based on the potential value of the crop. And so, for instance, say you're growing corn and you are renting land to do that, but the landowner is also helping to maintain the soil quality, maybe providing some equipment, maybe doing some of the labor themselves. They just can't do all of it. And you're either getting paid through the crop share to help work the land, or you are paying part of the share of the value of the crop to the owner so that you have the land to work. It can be worked both ways on that side. But the crop share lease is based on a proportion of each of the parties' inputs, and that will determine the amount of the crop that each side receives. So your crop share lease is a little more complicated than a straight cash lease, but they can be ideal for certain situations. So when you are thinking about a lease, it's really easy to go based on someone's character or how well you know someone. And, I know that you would never short me on something. So, we don't need a lease arrangement. It's not a big deal. Let's just go on and you send me some money. I don't want to have to go to a lawyer. I don't want to do anything official. I just want to, get my taxes covered. And, that's a very common lease that happens. But the problem is when you do that, there are different assumptions that go into everyone's lives, and everyone's background and personality is going to determine what those assumptions are. And knowing what the other person's assumptions are is critical when working with farmland because of replenishing the soil, equipment usage, things like that. Those are all things you need to actually discuss. And creating a lease allows you that format and that space in which you can safely discuss those types of things. Like, I just need to get this down on paper because I want to make sure I really understand what you are trying to say and that you understand what I am trying to say. You need to address all the details, and having a discussion about setting up and writing it down in a lease is a way to get all of those details addressed. Another big issue with verbal agreements is that the memory is faulty. So I don't know about you, but I can't remember what I had for breakfast yesterday. Nonetheless, what I talked about as far as a formal legal contract 2 years ago when I first started on this land. Because, we all have more discussions, and they're like, oh, hey, can I do this too? And they're like, yeah, sure, why not? And well, what about this? Can I do that? Sure, why not? And then it comes down to, hey, I really didn't want you to do that there. And I think this is an issue that needs to be dealt with. But there is no documentation as to what was allowed and what was not allowed. And then conflicts can come in, and it can really ruin some good relationships. So think of a lease as a relationship protector. And it's also going to help if there is a dispute, give a clear way to manage that dispute. In summary, a written lease can clarify the leasing arrangement, the detail and document each party's rights and obligations, help you manage disputes and misunderstandings, and help avoid any legal proceedings. No one wants to go to court. No one wants to have to deal with getting a lawyer and fighting for something that you feel was wrongfully taken from you or should have been rightfully yours. So, writing all this stuff up out front really does help maintain those relationships. And even among family members, if you are leasing from a family member, it is doubly essential to have a good, well-written, describing lease that covers all of the details, because you don't want to have to deal with a dispute with a family member that could potentially ruin your relationship, because they're family and they're going to be around. You have parents, you have siblings. It's important to help maintain those relationships. And one of the key things you can do if you are leasing land or using land that belongs to another family member, even if you're not paying anything for it, if they're just letting you use it, it's really important that you get the stipulations that are in the lease down. This is also going to help you when you go to get farm insurance. They're going to want a clear idea of who owns this property and who they are really insuring and what other insurances are on there, et cetera, et cetera. So really having a written lease is important. Another reason to have a written lease is because it allows you to go to a funding source that says, okay, you need to show me you have proof of ownership for this land. And you say, well, I'm only leasing it. And it's really hard to get some cost share funding or federal program money for land that you don't own unless you have a sound lease. And most of the time when you're looking at actual loans that are associated with farmland, say if you're going to buy a tractor or some kind of piece of equipment, they're going to want you to have a lease of a minimum of 5 years. But there are some situations where they will want you to have a 7-year revolving lease, which means that the lease you have automatically renews every year, so that should the property sell, your lease would be good for at least another 7 years, even once it is terminated. So that is really exceptional protection for the leasee, because it helps make sure that whatever investments they have put into the soil, if they built fences, you put a lot of work into farmland, and you want to make sure that you're going to have the opportunity to recoup those benefits, because soil remediation is slow, it takes time, and you're not going to see a lot of the hard work you put in for a couple of years when you're going into soil remediation and trying to improve soil quality. Also, putting fencing in is expensive, and you want to make sure that you're going to be able to get some return on that. So when you're talking to your potential landlord, do your best to try to get either a 5-year revolving lease or a 7-year revolving lease. And like I said, simply that means that it's good for 7 years, but it automatically renews every year so that you have 7 years to recoup after the lease is terminated. Now, sometimes landowners get a little nervous with that, because we're like, well, what if I want to sell my land? No one's going to want to buy land that has a lease on it. And that's not necessarily true. A lot of people who are buying land recognize that having a leasee on their property could be profitable for them as well. And they may not be buying land to farm it themselves, or they may end up working with the leasee to try to update the lease to reflect the terms of the new owner. Now, it is key, though, if you have a lease with a landowner, or if you have a leasee, it's very important that that lease at least is recognized somewhere in the official documentation of the property. So have it registered at the courthouse that this land does have a lease on it. And as the leasee, you really want to do that, because you don't want the new owner to say, well, he didn't tell me there was a lease on the land, so there effectively is no lease on the land, and I have full right to it. That's a really bad situation to be in. And land sometimes gets sold unexpectedly. Like I said earlier, maybe there's a big hospital expense. Maybe someone passed on and they didn't have the proper will. there are all sorts of things that can cause land to transfer ownership unexpectedly. And so it is important as the leasee to watch for those things and protect yourself ahead of time as you are getting a lease written. So to go along with that, another thing to recognize is you don't want to have someone send you a lease to sign and they're going to sign it whenever it comes back, or vice versa. You don't want to sign a lease and then send it to someone and expect them to sign it without your witness. So if one party has signed the lease and the other party has not, then the party that signed the lease is legally responsible for following it. But the person who has not signed the lease is not legally responsible for following it. So it's very important, if you are signing a lease, to make sure that both parties are together and signing the lease simultaneously. And if you want to take one step better, you would both sign the lease simultaneously in front of a notary public, have it notarized, and be official. That is really a good way to protect both parties in the sense that you are preventing an issue that comes up later on from someone saying, well, that wasn't in the lease. I didn't sign a lease. Well, yes, you did. Here's the lease. And again, another issue to consider is that if the land is jointly owned by a married couple, per se, both the husband and wife must be there to sign the lease. So one of the owners can't sign the lease on behalf of the other. They both have to be agreed. And now, if you are leasing from someone who is just managing the farm, or if the spouse doesn't have an interest in the farm and says, oh, hey, you just do everything, well, then they need to have a written document stating that the person who is making this lease with you has full legal rights to sublet the property. And so that's something else that you need to consider, is that whoever owns the land is responsible for signing off the rights to the land. And if the owner wants to sign that ability to a proxy, they can, but it does need to be in writing. Otherwise, it could just be some guy who showed up on the property, parked his trailer, and now is saying that he owns the property. So do make sure that the person who is signing your lease has the rights to do so. Now, to go back to recording the lease, like I said before, the lease is not valid to a new owner unless that new owner has been notified that there was a lease. So you need to make sure that you do everything you can as a leasee to make sure if they are selling it, that they have the opportunity to learn that there is a lease on the land. So you can go to the courthouse and have it registered. Now, sometimes, if you don't want the details of your lease, you can put a memorandum of a lease, which basically is a really brief document that says, hey, there's a lease on this property. And you don't have to go into all of the intricacies of your lease. You can just be really simple. And so that's something important to do as well, is just to make sure that there's information at the courthouse to notify a future buyer that the land is under lease. All right, so now before I run out of time here, I just want to go over some of the basic things that need to be included in a lease. And you can find some of this information online if you have access. Ohio State has a really good write-up on this for the legal aspects of Ohio farmland leases by Peggy Kirk Hall. She does a lot of great work in trying to help farmers understand the legalities that face them as farmers. There's also, if you wanted to contact me at my office, I'd be happy to send you some information on leasing as well. And if you really want to get into it, Ag Lease 101 is a really great learning opportunity. They have some really short videos you can watch and to really give you the details of how to build a strong lease. And I really suggest getting some more information if you're going to do a crop share lease, or even a cow share lease can be done too. And those are all based on the end value of the crop that's being sold, be it livestock or produce or grain. Okay, so terms of the lease agreement. You need to, of course, have the date that it starts. You need to know when your lease starts. You also need to know the name and addresses of the landlord and the person who is making the lease or who is signing the lease with the landlord. So the person that owns the property, the person that's leasing the property, you need to know who they are and where they live. You also need a legal description of the leased property. Now, you don't have to go into a whole lot of detail on this, but you do need to have reference to the legal description. So you can basically take your tax assessment record and take that little blurb on there of where your property is located and use that in your lease agreement. But it's always good to have a map that shows your boundaries, especially when you're trying to say, okay, this is my uncle's land and he doesn't want you on there. So you have to make sure you don't cross this invisible line in the middle of the field. Having a map that shows that with some measurements is really important. Also, you want to look at the time period of your lease. So you have your beginning date and you need to have an ending date as well. So is this a 1-year lease? Is this a 5-year lease? Is this a 7-year lease? Does it renew? What are the start and end dates for the lease? Also, you want to know how much you're getting for the lease or how much you're paying for it. So if it's a crop share, you need to describe who's putting in what and who gets what share as a percentage basis. You also need to state how rent should be paid and if there are late penalties, what they are and how they'll be dealt with. So the last thing you want is someone to be on your land, not giving you the money they promised you they would give you, and you have no repercussions against that. So you need to make sure that it's laid out how rent needs to be paid and what are penalties for late payments. You also need to consider insurance on the property and on the crops. So consider who's paying for the insurance. What amount are they paying? Does the leasee need to pay the property insurance or is the lessor going to pay it? And if you are selling a crop, be it livestock or lettuces, what other types of insurance do you need? What if there's a tractor rollover? Whose insurance is going to cover that first? Also, you want to talk about how the lease can be terminated and what are the requirements for notification should the lease be terminated. Lease can be terminated for lots of reasons. It can be terminated for lack of payment. It can be terminated because the property sold. It can be terminated because they don't like you anymore. Lots of things can happen. And as long as you have it in writing, you know what to expect. There's also reimbursement provisions. If you are doing you've done some work on the field and they terminate the lease before you get to harvest or plant, that should be described in there as well. And you need to talk about who is doing the soil fertility management, how it should be monitored. Typically the leasee is going to be the one that's out there working with it, and they could have the opportunity to monitor those soil fertility and pH levels. But you need to be clear who is going to be doing that and who orders the fertilizer, who spreads the fertilizer. You don't have to write out every single detail, but you do need to have the discussion about it. And then write down enough information so that in 1.5 years, when you've been doing all the work and they promise to do half the work, you can go back to your lease and say, look, you said that you would buy it and spread it. I've been spreading it and using my time and equipment to do that. So I think we need to renegotiate the value of this lease. Also, you want to make sure that you describe whatever you don't want people to do on your land. If you don't want them to spray certain chemicals, say you're letting them farm it, but your ultimate goal is to grow some timber for your grandkids so that they have money to go to college. So you want to make sure that they're not using a long-term residual herbicide like Spike, which will prevent tree growth for up to 7 years. So you want to make sure that you are stipulating residual herbicides, or if you want to do organic production, you want to maintain this land as organic production. So these are things you need to also discuss in this lease. And unfortunately, I am out of time on this. So I thank you for tuning in to Extension Calling. And I will give you the rest of this next week, along with some information on who's to control your noxious weeds, and maybe some information on how to do that. So make sure you tune in next week, and we'll talk a little bit about multiflora rose control and knotweed.
Do you have questions about the COVID-19 vaccination? Do you want to know who can get it, where to get it, or do you have general questions about COVID-19 vaccines? Vaccinate.wv.gov has the info you are looking for. You can also call the West Virginia COVID-19 Vaccine Info Line to talk to a representative and find out more at 1-833-734-0965. Again, that's vaccinate.wv.gov or 1-833-734-0965 to get your COVID-19 vaccination questions answered. This message was brought to you by the WVU Extension Service. Thanks for listening to Extension Calling. This show is a collaboration between OSU Belmont County Extension Educator Dan Lima and WVU Ohio County Extension Agent Karen Cox. If you'd like a transcript of this show, contact us at the office. Also, let us know if you enjoy the show by ranking us on your podcast app.